Today we will look at where do these texts that we have been trying to study and read and understand, where do they actually come from? Because today some of us don't even open a book to read them, right? The Pali texts, you actually find them all on the computer now, on the internet, on an app. But so there's like the texts have a whole material basis and a history, and how did they actually get to us? So that's quite a fascinating story. So we have to start in the beginnings of Buddhism, as shown on this map, just that we know geographically where we are in India, 6th, 5th century BC. So you see where the Buddha lived, northeast India, in the Ganges Valley, this sort of area, and he would have walked pretty much mostly in this area. There's no evidence that he ever got anywhere outside this sort of region. And then,
can you please mention that how do we know the identity of the Buddha not being a legend?
well, there are the relics that were found in some of these places. I will show at a later map. There are maps also of the Ashokan edicts that have been found carved into rock in many places, and where Ashoka lived some couple centuries after the Buddha. So the tradition would have been still pretty well known, pretty alive. So they would have known where these events happened. Right.
Yes, and this is what was discovered by British archaeologists.
Right. So here we have also the location of the first council at Rajagaha, which is of interest to us because this is where all the Buddhist texts get for the first time really gathered and somehow systematically edited, it seems. So it's still in this area. And then here you see Ashokan missions, 3rd century BC. So when King Ashoka embraced Buddhism, and then he wanted to spread it, and he sent these what I call the Dhammadutas, the missionaries, to several areas, and he describes it in one of these edicts, and he mentions that he sent some missionary, for example, to Suvarnabhumi, which it's assumed is this sort of area around like Burma, Thailand, even like Malaysia, this whole area, and some to Sri Lanka, some to different parts of India, and then especially here to the north near the Himalayas, and then here this Kashmira Gandhara, this region. This is the one that we'll be also talking about today, which is today basically Pakistan and part of Afghanistan. And then he mentions also the Yonas, which are the Greeks, and we don't know how far they went, whether they actually went to Greece or rather to some areas that were by that time occupied by the Greeks. Because the Greeks then came with Alexander the Great to this area of Gandhara, and there was this blending of Buddhism and the Greek culture and the script. So
I remember an article you sent sometime when in Greece, they discovered the grave of one of the missionaries that Ashoka has sent.
I'm not sure about Greece. I can't remember that, but
this was somewhere in Athens, I think, where they discovered this grave where they identified it as one of the missionaries that came from Ashoka.
I'm not sure. There might be some speculation about, you find some grave with some name and then you try to guess who that might have been. But anyway, so, there might still be some surprises. So you see this Gandhara where it is, and it was basically on part of the Silk Route. The Silk Roads where people traveled. There was definitely contact between like the Middle East here, like Greece, Turkey, and going past here through Iran. So the Persian Empire actually was reached up to Gandhara area until like I think the 4th century BC. So the Iranian, the Persian Empire, and they had a script. They had this Persian script, and so this Aramaic script. And it seems that this Gandhari language and the script that it's using, the Kharosthi script, and then the Brahmi script later, they were kind of influenced from this direction. It seems that's what the scholars think. All right. So anyway, a few maps, just that you know where Buddhism traveled. Okay.
So which road did Bodhidharma take to China?
Yeah, so those are the later pilgrims. So this Gandhara area is interesting in that one of the Chinese, I'm not sure which way Bodhidharma went to India. It might have been went to China. Could have been by the Silk Route across the desert and so on, or by boat. There were the two main routes going around by boat. But here is another map, bit more detail. So you see, this is the current borders. What is like India, Pakistan, and this is the area we are talking about here. These are the main areas where these texts have been found. But this area of Gandhara reached into like what is now China, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. So in this sort of greater Gandhara region, that's where this sort of Buddhist culture, they were all Buddhist at a certain time, from like the Buddhism would have spread there, sometime after the time of the Buddha, and then it stayed Buddhist until basically Islam took over. And that it starts sort of around I think the 7th, 8th century, and gradually, Buddhism was, pushed out and didn't exist after that anymore. There's this town here called Taxila, but in the Buddhist text you come across it as Takasila. And you find that this is often then mentioned in the Buddhist text as like some kind of place where people used to go to study. Like, for example, the Dr. Jivaka, he went to this town apparently to learn medicine. But it was quite a center of learning and so on. And here, Gilgit and Bamiyan, Kabul, these places, now they are all in this sort of strict Muslim areas, but used to be really Buddhist. And there is a lot of this ancient Buddhist art there, and stupas, and some of them are being restored, but also the Bamiyan Buddhas were, of course, destroyed. So here is an introduction, a little bit of introduction. So we are talking now okay, just to give a introduction. So we know the Pāli text, but here I'm trying to show you that this is a fairly recent discovery. Like since the 1990s, there have been a lot of new discoveries kind of connected with these wars in Afghanistan, and things have come to light that previously the scholars we only had the Pāli canon basically as the only complete Tipitaka basically of one early Buddhist school. And then we had some Chinese translations and Tibetan translations and so on, but they are kind of like secondary, they are really based, it's already translated into other languages, it's a bit further removed from the originals. But they found one text in this Gandhari language. Gandhari, it was a kind of a Dhammapada version of the Dhammapada already like in 1890. So they knew there were other early Buddhist canons of other early Buddhist schools, but they only had like one small example of it. So they didn't know, if there is any more, if it all disappeared, or how it all, people kind of assumed that the Pāli canon was the only source we could ever rely on there is a kind of belief basically. Each of these schools obviously would have presented their version of the recorded teachings as the version that was agreed at the first council after the Buddha's parinibbana, right? So there is the record of the first council in Rajagaha after the Buddha passes away. Then the Arahants, 500 Arahants gather, and then they recite during the Vasa, all the suttas and the Vinaya. So, and then of course the Pāli commentaries later say, well, this is exactly word by word what's in our version of the text. But that seems to be a kind of a later, interpretation. What seems more likely that this early kind of corpus or this gathering of Buddhist teachings then spread geographically and went to different areas of India. And then people also preserved it in different dialects, so they were slightly different from one another. And now we have this. After these texts were found, basically, we can start to compare, like the canon that later went down to south to Sri Lanka, where it was finally written down, like 1st century BC, and this one that went to the northwest, Gandhara. They seem to have been written down around the same time, basically, 1st century BC. And now we can compare, it's kind of exciting because you can verify, okay, how much do they differ? How much are they the same?
But
And
what is the extent of these scripts found in Gandhara?
so we have basically like fragments, and I'm going to show you later some of them. And apparently,
My understanding from the articles you sent is that they found like small bits of texts, not entire Nikayas.
no. So the scholars are trying to decipher them and then compare them to, say, existing Chinese translations or some other Tibetan translations, and then identify which school. There were they talk about 18 early Buddhist schools, So which ones could they belong to? And it seems in this region there was a school which was a part of the Mahasanghika, branch, the early Buddhist schools, and it's called the Lokottaravada school. And Mahasanghika Lokottaravada, it's a kind of a double name. So it was one of the really early schools of Buddhism, and it's probably mostly belong to them. It seems when these Taliban, were like blowing up the big Buddhas in Bamiyan, then some of the local people apparently went hiding in these caves, and they kind of rescued some of the texts from there. And then later these texts found their way onto the kind of black market, through probably several hands. And they were also damaged in the process because they were very brittle when people took them out. So some of them actually started falling apart, and finally they were basically ended up on this antiquity market, and some rich people. Basically, there are rich people who love buying ancient things and preserving them and giving them to museums to be studied. So fortunately, this has happened, and now we have these texts finally. It's quite a lot of texts, and there could be more that come to light. And now there's a few that I wanted to actually show you. These scholars working on them, reconstructing them, they can now actually present complete translations, and we can compare them with Pali text and see how much they differ. So I wanted to show you a few examples that they.
It says that just the page that you had there says that
Mhm.
the around fourth line from the bottom is that they found large quantity of manuscript fragments, which, when gathered together, made a pile approximately
Yeah.
10 centimeter high. That's significant amount of material.
There's several collections basically, and they have been preserved in different museums and places. There's a big collection in Norway. Basically, there are some of these people who have a lot of money, and they are also philanthropists. They want to actually do something useful with it, so they don't mind paying quite a lot to some dealers to save it, and then that's great because they really saved it from destruction. Because the locals now, there are like reports that some people, the locals who found them, they just took these texts and rolled them to make cigarettes from them because they didn't know what was written on them. So it's much better to sell them to a museum. And then they use these scripts. This is, if you look at it, this is the Brahmi script. So if you look at some of these Ashokan pillars, they have this kind of script, which is very much like square and round like that. That's called Brahmi. So a few of them are written in this script, but then it changes this Brahmi to be written more like this. And then there's this Karoshti, which is this script that's related to this Aramaic script, something related to Persia. And this is written from right to left. And it looks like this. It's very nice, kind of a cursive script. and they wrote it with some kind of ink on birch bark. So the birch tree, you can strip the bark of the birch tree and then like smooth it, and then you can actually write on it, and then you roll them up or fold them. And the way they found
the actual bark is not processed, like into fiber or something and woven.
No.
So you just take you just lay out the bark as it is and try to find smooth parts to write on.
Yeah.
That's
These are
amazing.
the kind of scholars here that work on it. And they actually show you what they had to work with. They
I see wood chips.
yeah, it was pretty much like let's see, Skoyan collection. This is the Norwegian one. Anyway, so here we come to what they call the Agama Sutras. These are like that's what we would call the Nikayas. Basically, here we find the correspondences to something that we have in the Pāli Suttas. So here they actually show you one example, very nice. Changi Sutra, it's called in this version. So, and it corresponds to the Majjhima Nikaya, what's called the Chanki Sutta. So, yeah, there's the Brahmin that speaks to the Buddha. This is what it looks like, the fragments. And this one is actually, I think, not on birch, but this one is on palm leaves. So some of them were on palm leaves, and it's from the 4th century AD. So this is not the earliest one. They did carbon dating. And they found, I think some of the earliest ones that they found were like 1st century BC. And then, but most of them maybe a bit later. Chanki Sutra, and you see it. You can compare it. So sometimes they found, for example, 24 fragments of the manuscript, roughly 83% of the whole text. So sometimes you don't have the whole thing, but enough to compare. So this is the story, and then the scholars, they can actually transcribe it like into something like this. So this is what's called
let's try to read some of it. It looks quite recognizable.
Maybe I have another one which shows you even the correspondence with the Pāli, which will be easier. Because this one only shows the Gandhari. But you see, it's quite legible, but I'll show you a slightly better one. This is another one. This is Mahaparinirvana Sutra. So again, kind of similar. And here, often what happens is, oh yes, here they are trying to establish like maybe this belongs, say, to another school, the Sarvastivada or Mula Sarvastivada school. So sometimes there are certain ways you can identify that certain schools, they would have like added or used certain terms or edited the text in their own way, and so it's possible to identify which school it belonged to. So it seems it was kind of it didn't all belong to one school. And this is also Parinirvana Sutra. Let's see. So this is you see, if you know the Mahaparinirvana Sutta, this is the passage where the Buddha is saying, oh yes, that he will not attain parinibbana until he has all these followers who are like who have realized the Dhamma. And this is about building a stupa, the main road. So you can identify different corresponding passages. This is an interesting one, actually. This is called the Andha Sutra. And it's actually a combination of like 3 Pāli sutras, but here it is one text. In this sutra, the Buddha describes 3 types of people, the one without any eyes, one-eyed, and two-eyed. It's in the Anguttara Nikaya. And you see here, here is the text. There are people who don't have any eye, people who like misuse what they have, and then the people who have one eye. Basically, the person who has one eye, he does something for his own benefit, but doesn't do anything for the benefit of others. The one who has 2 eyes is doing both for his own benefit and for the benefit of others. right? So here we can identify actually a corresponding Anguttara Nikaya passage. Agama Sutra. Something is in a different language called Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. So over time, this because Sanskrit became kind of the main like Indian language for all these kind of sciences and religions. So they kind of started to influence the Buddhists as well. So some of the schools started using that language. And this manuscript again corresponds to what we call the Sigalovada Sutta. This one is in the Digha Nikaya, is a famous sutta where the Buddha gives basically advice to a layperson, this Sigala, how to live a good life. It's kind of a famous instruction for lay people. Then there are some Mahayana sutras. So that's interesting that some of the earliest of these Prajna Paramita sutras were also found in this area. This is 3rd century AD. So some scholars now think that actually this might have been the area where the whole Mahayana movement even started, because there were all these like influences coming from the West, from this like Persia, Iran, kind of maybe more theistic. So it's a kind of a
The Jetavana in Sri Lanka, the great the two great monastic complexes there in Sri Lanka in around Anuradhapura, like they had several thousands of monks living there, and they were also large. Where is the Samadhi? Where is the Samadhi Buddha? At the Jetavana maybe. So that was their Mahayana center there, and
yes,
I remember the time period for that is like 12th century. So that's a much later Mahayana center. So this would be an earlier Mahayana
yes,
center where they already have these suttas established, like the Prajnaparamita. But
that's the earliest.
where did they get the suttas then? Where does the sutta, like these are newly composed suttas like the Prajnaparamita? Where do they arrive to Gandhara?
Well, the scholars think maybe they were actually created there because basically all these early Buddhist schools, they start to develop the Abhidharma as well. This is, you will see later here, there are some Abhidharma texts, and every school developed their own. So they were speculating about all these different philosophical principles, and they just found even some new Abhidharmas here in this area too. And it seems that this Prajna Paramita, this kind of Mahayana text, they are kind of a reaction to that, talking about emptiness, how all these dharmas are actually empty and so on. So there was a whole kind of development of philosophy and practice based on that. So it might have well started there because, like, I think Ajahn Sona in his video, he has this sort of theory that, the Greeks, they brought this kind of tradition of like logic and logical analysis, and that we find like in the Milinda Panha and so on. They were in this area, so it could have sparked this kind of whole development. Yeah. But anyway, here another example. This is more interesting for us because we can actually identify more clearly which school it belongs to when we find a Vinaya text. Because the Vinaya text, of course, every one of these early Buddhist schools, I mean, a lot of the Vinaya versions were quite similar, but there are some small differences. So this is 4th century AD, and this is a kind of Vinaya text. They call it the Pratimoksha Sutra, which is basically the Patimokkha. And again, belongs to this Mahasangika Lokuttaravada school. And here we can identify an actual passage that you will be familiar with. So here is a description of how one of the rules, how it was, origin story of one of the rules. This is a Pachitya, exactly. Nisagya Pachitya is about the height of height of the 8 fingers long. Something, how long are the legs of of some couch or bed? And this is one. This is another one. This is okay. I think this is still okay. Still that rule. And this is the other Pācitya. It's about reciting a text together with a layperson. About that rule, Pācitya, that a monk should not basically have a layperson learn some of these texts by reciting with him. And here is exactly describing, like, we don't have this kind of description, for example, in the Pāli text or Pāli commentary, but here it is. So what is a Pācitya? What is not a Pācitya? Here is about making statements about maybe making claims again. Pācitya. I have attained tranquility and insight. These are the things that if it is true, he commits a Pācitya. That's the rule about not telling an ordained layperson. So here you see this is very similar to Pali version. And here, this is about Dabba Malaputta. So here, his name is spelled like this, Dravya. Yeah. So again, something we are familiar with. This is what's called Karmavachana. It means Kamavacha. So these are specific text for like what we call the Sangakama procedures. Like when we recite here, for example, this is about ordination, about giving them the bowl and robes, requesting upasampada, katina, uposatha, you see, all these things are there. But there are small differences. Maybe here there will be one that we can actually read, because you might be familiar. Oh, this is interesting. The qualifications of a Vinayadhara. Upali was the Vinaya expert, and here's a text saying, what qualities should a Vinaya expert possess? So, possessed of the 14 qualities, he's a Vinayadhara. So he should know what is an offense, what is not an offense, what is a serious offense, concealing, confessing, non-confessing, rehabilitation, and then it goes into having the jhanas and being basically an arahant. Or having the right behavior of the Patimokkha. So again, similar passages we find in the Vinaya. And then there is Abhidhamma. So like I said, there are many, basically all the early Buddhist schools, they started classifying and developing new ways of classification, basically, of all these different dharmas. And there are many ways. So the Theravada Abhidhamma is just one of them. And that's where I think they started to differ, basically, from each other and break apart. There were maybe small Vinaya differences, but mainly Vinaya seem to have been fairly in common. But these Abhidharmas is where they started to differ most. Yeah. You see, like these different Pali terms, what level do they belong to, and so on.
So if they already have Abhidhamma text here, then how does this correlate with the Abhidharma that is in Sri Lanka, for example?
Yeah, so it seems the Theravada school basically,
they are very proud of their own heritage and their own legacy of the Abhidharma tradition.
Yes, but it's again, there is this legend that it's similar to this how the Mahayana basically also came up with this kind of legend that these texts were really taught by the Buddha, but then nobody could really understand them, so they were hidden in the Naga realm, and then some hundreds of years later, the Nagas gave them to some people who were finally ready for them. So again, there's a legend about Abhidharma texts that the Buddha taught them to the Devas in the Tavatimsa heaven, and then later the Devas taught them or to Sariputta maybe, who taught it. But it seems obvious that there are like stories trying to justify some new development, a new doctrine that is then being taught, And then there are a lot of Abhidharma texts, and there are things called the Avadana, which are like stories, kind of similar to kind of quite long stories. In the Pāli, it's called Apadana, and they are really quite popular in Southeast Asia. There's many of these Apadanas or Avadana stories. It's basically like they remind you of, say, the Dhammapada commentary, or basically the commentary is describing like the lives of some of the disciples in their past lives, the good things they have done, some dana, or maybe they built a golden stupa, and then in this life, then they realize this and that. It's a kind of the later development of trying to describe basically the teaching of karma in some practical terms that people cannot simply understand, but it often seems to be very oversimplifying the teaching of karma. But nevertheless, they were very influential in shaping the kind of popular Buddhism. Right. So this is there's some other. This is another type of script. This is interesting. It's called the Bactrian script, Greco-Bactrian script. So when the Greeks came to this area, they also not just brought the art, and the first Buddhist statues were made looking like Apollo, but they also brought the Greek script. So some of the texts were actually even written. You see, this is Greek, more or less. And there was something written on where is it, on metal. They only found one, because mostly you see things deteriorate if it's not chiseled into rock or inscribed on some kind of metal, then it's hard to preserve. So the way, I don't have a picture here, but the way they actually found these things was strangely in clay jars. Maybe this kind of jar, maybe not, this is a bit too decorated. Yeah, so this is a piece of metal. They found it somewhere. I think it's copper. Yeah, copper plate. And this is interesting. It's Ye Dhamma. It's called the Ye Dharma formula. Now, this is a very famous place, very famous passage. Maybe you remember when Asaji meets Upatissa, later known as Sariputta, and then he teaches him these 4 lines. It's a basically formulation of, paticca samuppada. The dhammas that arise from a cause, ye dhamma hetupabhava, Tathagata declared what is their cause and what is their cessation. So this became like a very popular phrase to write anywhere and put it inside of stupas, put it inside of around religious monuments, and you find it everywhere in the early kind of Buddhist world. So then depending on how it's written, if it's in Pāli or in
Paticca Samuppada lucky charm.
Yeah.
This is a Paticca Samuppada lucky charm.
This is. And this is probably the clay jar. So the text, most of them seem to have been like stuffed, basically. These kind of rolled manuscripts were kind of stuffed inside a jar like this and sealed. And then they were just buried on the ground in mostly these caves that belong to the monasteries or in some monastic complex. And they even think that maybe this was a kind of respectful way of disposing of these texts, that they were actually meant to be, instead of burning them or something when they were no longer in use, they would just bury them respectfully in that way. And this is why they were preserved.
Like maybe these are the, like during the copying process, these would be the old versions that they don't want to burn, but they also don't want to keep them around.
Exactly. So that's how most of them were found. But of course, when you bury something for 2,000 years, and it's very dry area, it's kind of like a desert area. Some of it also is quite high elevation. So it's not this kind of humid tropical climate like Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, where everything just falls apart really very quickly. So here they were really preserved very well. But as soon as these people, took them out, then they start to have contact with oxygen and deteriorate. So sometimes they try to spray them with something or put them in some plastic. So they might have damaged some of them, but it's possible usually to restore them. Yeah. Now, yes, I wanted to show you. I have this nice picture here. somebody made, showing kind of the evolution of these, these texts. So these are the birch barks, and this is how you wrote it.
Which script is that? That's a Devanagari, no, Ajahn Kavisaku, or a precursor to Devanagari?
I think it might be that one of the versions of the Brahmi script. Yeah. But basically
that was like the Brahmi was this very the Brahmi script is this square shapes.
Yes, but then it had other later versions, like in the one in Bamiyan was already kind of developed this kind of shape. So I think there might be one of the versions. But yeah, basically later this forms the basis of all the Southeast Asian scripts, basically. And then this is, so you see the also Gandhari language is, we can talk about it in a while. Basically, it seems to be kind of simplified Pali. The Pali is very beautiful, very elegant. There are all these double consonants. It's very rhythmic. Whereas this Gandhari, it seems to be like a dialect of the northwestern dialect, where it's just like the way people talk. And you might think, oh, that's strange. Why shouldn't they have preserved it like exactly the way the Buddha said it? And but you have to imagine, the geographical distances in those days and how people would have like traveled. Maybe they went somewhere, a group of monks, and then they kind of, it's a bit like even today, if you go, say, even within England, for example, if you speak, the what they call the Queen's English somewhere in the southeast of England, apparently that's like the purest English. But you only need to go to like Wales, Scotland, Northern England, and you almost can't understand what the people are saying. It's such a difference. And this is at a time of like, media and television. Everybody can like kind of hear the proper English, but still they speak quite in a different way. So imagine how it was in those days. So they would have developed their own kind of dialects. So basically the text, the message would have been the same, but you express it slightly differently, right? And Sri Lanka, you asked before about Sri Lanka. So it seems like this Theravada school moved like more south. This particular, sometimes it's called the Theria school or the Theravamsa. So it was just one of the schools that survived, and through a kind of historical accident, maybe because Sri Lanka was more isolated than from the rest of the Indian continent, it just survived in Sri Lanka because it was a little bit more shielded from all these invasions and so on. So this is what we have, there is, the Abhidhamma would have been earlier than Sri Lanka. That would have been already developed, I think, when it was in southern India, but it was finally preserved there in Sri Lanka, And then it seems like they didn't really add much more. Like the canon was closed. Once they wrote it down, they didn't keep adding new things. Instead, they wrote these commentaries, the Atthakathas, which is like another layer on top of that. But some of these other schools, it seems like they kept.
When Ashoka's mission arrives in Gandhara and when it arrives in Sri Lanka, are they already transmitting Abhidhamma, for example?
Yeah, definitely. I think that would have all developed quite early, probably after the, even within the first couple of centuries after the Buddha. Because the disciples already start like systematizing and developing their different ways of, the Indians, they really like this.
They would have the beginning of the Abhidhamma already in Ashoka's time, right? And then the delegation arrives in, say, Sri Lanka. And there in the 5th century, Buddhaghosa writes the Visuddhimagga and the other commentaries and the Vinaya commentaries, and these are the unique Sri Lankan editions, no? And in Gandhara, you have this other transmission that they carry they carry what they have from the Nikayas and what they have from the Abhidhamma, but there the Mahayana school develops better. No, Nagarjuna is also in that area, isn't he? In that time period. That's Nagarjuna's. No, Nagarjuna's Madhyamika. Which century is that?
I think that's later, but because what you have in some of these northern Indian tradition is you get these like big Buddhist universities like Nalanda, no? Nalanda is the biggest one. I think that was later, like, I don't know, 5th, 6th century, because these Chinese pilgrims, the earliest Chinese pilgrim who traveled across the Silk Route came to India. I think this Fashion, I think he was about, what, 4th century or 3rd century AD. And then the most famous one is this Xuanzang in the 6th, 7th century AD. They went to this region, Gandhara, and they went to all these places, and they went to India in order to study at that Nalanda University. So at that time, Buddhism was still flourishing and very big, and many schools. So he gave very good reports, and that's why we can like verify where all these places were. But after that, soon after that, I think after that, the 8th century, it really goes into decline, and there are these like invasions by the Muslims. They destroy a lot of things, and it starts to decline, and then slowly disappear from India. But in Sri Lanka, because of that isolation, it survived, and then from there it spread to, like the rest of these Southeast Asian countries, Burma, Thailand. But there were several like waves and coming and going. So this is something about the text. What I wanted to say was so Pāli again.
Let's look at the other scripts that you have on that image. We've only been looking at these two.
I don't know much about them, but it's so the Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. Like I said, some of these early Buddhist schools later on they started writing it down, which was like the modern language of the day. Like the latest. So they try to Sanskritize everything, so it looks a bit different. And then Chinese, the big difference when you started translating into Chinese. So there were these monks who carried the text to China, and they wanted to translate them. But Chinese is a completely different language. Chinese language are just these characters that the symbols represent like one word, but there is no kind of grammar, or the verbs are not. It doesn't change. There's no suffixes and inflections or whatever. So it's a very different way of writing the text. So they say it's just the order of the characters indicates some kind of logical, on this, because of this, then that.
Basically, it's a conceptual language.
Yeah. So you see, the Chinese translation will never be as accurate as some kind of early dialect. And it seems the Chinese translations also, we cannot assume that now the scholars can try to kind of trace it all back, like what kind of language did the Chinese monks translate it from? And it seems they're not translating it from Pali. They're not even translating it from Sanskrit. It seems like they were translating it from various, what I call the Prakrits. Prakrits are these kind of more like vernacular spoken dialects. So there seem to have been like many different versions, how people preserved it. And then these ones I don't even know about. These are when you later have kind of this, what we can call decline of Buddhism in India, when it sort of mixes with these Hindu Tantra and so on. So they had some of this other script.
But if we're talking about the languages, let's distinguish the Magadha, Pali, and the Sanskrit then.
Exactly.
Because when people ask what is Pali, then we start talking about Magadha and the Sanskrit and the hybridization and so on.
So in the Pali commentaries, they have this, again, kind of naive sort of view or theory that I think it's also in competition actually with Sanskrit, because Sanskrit is regarded as some kind of a sacred language, that every syllable, every sound represents something mystical, or the beginning of the universe is in the Om syllable and so on. So they, I think, make a similar kind of claim, saying that Pali is a kind of I think in Buddhaghosa's one of the texts, I think he says that if a child was born somewhere where nobody would speak any language, then the child would automatically start to speak in Pali, because it's a kind of it's a kind of a sacred language. They try to make this sort of claim, right? But so what seems more possible is that the scholars now can compare these different dialects, and they say it doesn't seem to be just like the spoken language of Magadha, which was the area where the Buddha mostly was living, staying. Rather, that it seems to have been a kind of a dialect more of the Western India, because you can find some of these linguistic elements still remain in some of the, especially poetry. So it seems like they just created this slightly artificial, kind of like the literary language, where everything would be very nicely defined and there will be grammar rules and everything, and in that way it was then preserved. But that wouldn't have happened at the first council yet. That took some time, and that was the particular group of monks that then formed this Theravada school, and they preserved it in that way. But it seems that there were other maybe some of these other Theras from the first council. They just went in another direction, where they went north, they went west, and then they didn't have much contact with each other for centuries, and they just preserved it slightly differently. So there is even evidence of that. When you read the account of the first council in the Vinaya Pitaka, there was that monk called Purana that was he missed the first council because he was traveling with a group of 500 monks, and then when they finished the first council, he arrived, and then they told him, Venerable Purana, we have now kind of recited all the suttas and Vinaya together. Now come and accept our version of this of the teachings. And he says, Sadhu, the suttas, the Vinaya have been well recited by the elders, but I will prefer to keep remembering the teachings as exactly the way I heard them from the Buddha. Yeah. So he had his own original version that he wanted to hang on to, rather than kind of relearn it in this kind of new edited version. So it's already recorded there. Okay. So you can think of this Pāli version as a kind of, they compare it to the Church Latin of Europe. So Latin was this kind of dead language, which then became the standard language of scientists, and for centuries it was the language just didn't change anymore, and you could record everything in it. So that's how it functions basically even until today in Southeast Asia. Right? And the material, so we have the palm leaves. Later, so the birch bark was used only in that Gandhara region, because birch doesn't grow in humid climate. You can find it in most northern hemisphere, but more in colder countries. But the palm leaves were used most. So that's the second one here. See, they are flat, long leaves. You have to collect it from the palm tree, and I think boil it and kind of scrape it and clean it, and then you scratch the letters. But the letters have to be round, because if you did a long, you could break the palm leaf if you were if the lines were straight. So that's why they are so kind of rounded letters. And you have to copy them, and you have these holes, and then you put a string through them, and that's how they are held together. And then you turn the leaf as you read it. And they are often written on both sides to save space. But you have to basically recopy them every, 50 years, 100 years. Otherwise, you lose the text. So that's what happened mostly in Sri Lanka, and then it spread to other countries. So the script can differ. So in Sri Lanka, they use the Sinhala script. In Burma, Burmese script. In Thailand, they use the Khmer script. But they're all ultimately derived from this Brahmi of India. But the language is the same, it's Pāli. Mm-hmm. All right. And now I still had something here to show you. Mm-hmm.
Roger.
Yes.
Can I say something about the Chinese street?
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, there are some speculation that the Chinese parallel in general from the Pāli can be useful, because apparently it wasn't in China. It wasn't that Buddhism wasn't that popular, and in the south,
Mm-hmm.
the south. So basically, there were less alterations of the texts, less it was like much more preserved. And so nowadays, when you read Chinese Pāli, Chinese Agama, for example, they offer much more, sometimes they offer much more details than the Pāli version. In some of them.
It's not sure. It seems to be kind of a mixture, because basically what these monks did, they went to India. Like imagine they heard in China, they had just kind of a vague idea of Buddhism, and then they sent these pilgrims, or they wanted to go themselves to really find, because they got like little bits and pieces of this new teaching of Buddhism. They didn't really know, like especially they wanted to get the Patimokkha text, the Vinaya text, to establish a full monastic tradition, and then all these sutras. But by the time these pilgrims went to India, they found like so many different schools and so many different versions of the canon. So it seems they brought, say Anguttara Nikaya of the Sarvastivada school, and then they brought a Vinaya of the Dharmaguptaka school, and many, and they just started translating everything. So we find in the Chinese versions, they find lots of these. It's like, they're not sure, bits from this school, many, say 3 different translations of the Anguttara Nikaya, and they are all from different schools, for example. So it's a kind of a bit of a mishmash of everything. But sometimes it's quite good apparently to then use it and compare it with what we have, say, in the Pāli, just to cross-check. And then here what I'm showing you is there is a Thai monk called Ajahn Aryavangsa, who in the last few years was going a lot to what's called the Swat Valley in Pakistan, which is one of the areas where there's also a lot of these archaeological remains and Gandhara, and he's kind of trying to revive some of these old stupas. But actually in Pakistan they are a bit more like interested to actually do it themselves. There's like a lot of carvings and so on. They are kind of interested to develop this Buddhist tourism, basically, So because they know they are not so radical like in the Afghanistan that they would destroy it. But of course, so there are some government ministers and people like that who are quite sympathetic, and they cooperate like with the Thai government and other governments. So there are these old stupas that are built there. Now the English, when the English were there, like over 100 years ago, some of them already started excavating it, and they found some, like relics and some other texts. So some of those things are actually in the British Museum. You can find it in England. Some of them, they're probably looted, some of it also, and sold it, but some of it was probably preserved. And then, these stupas, some of them were damaged, or maybe even somebody else tried to get in and steal some. They thought maybe there's some gold in there. But basically, they still find quite a lot of these stupas. They're quite huge and quite beautiful. And it's the Thai monk. He actually spent the whole Vasa there with a few monks in one of the kind of museums in Pakistan. And it was a whole kind of a PR thing around it, trying to kind of revive. I mean, it's not about, the people are all Muslims today, but you find these basically remains of ancient monasteries. You can see exactly how they were built. You see that they had these kind of little cells. So you can pretty much imagine that it would have been a very prosperous era. I think this is the reciting Patimokkha, when they were spending the Vasa at the museum. And he's quite connected with the Thai royalty, I think, the Thai royal family. So it might be a kind of a good way to preserve these things, and that they won't damage them. They're not bombing them, or I think even the Pakistanis themselves, they seem quite keen to preserve it. So who knows what will still be found there. Some of these monasteries were very, very huge, very big. You see, these are the individual cells, and there would have been like a big stupa in the middle usually. There's big complexes. So you can guess all these descriptions that we have in the Vinaya. That's one thing some people speculate that the Vinaya, even the Pāli Vinaya, that some of the descriptions there really cannot come from the Buddha himself, because in the time of the Buddha there were some monasteries established, but they would have been fairly simple, some maybe bamboo huts or But some of the descriptions of like the lodgings, the vihara, looking after all these different things to do with the lodging, the kitchen, the storeroom, and all these things seem to be a little bit too developed. So some of the scholars think maybe the Vinaya was not closed until maybe like the 2nd century after the Buddha's parinibbana, and when the monastery started to get more developed, like into proper, big complexes like this one. Yeah, this is one of the famous monasteries, which is still very nicely preserved. And this was on the Silk Route. So from here, they would have carried on. So the monks usually went with the traders, with the merchants, with the caravans, with, horses or something across this desert, Gobi Desert, into China. And that's how Buddhism spread all the way to Korea, Japan, through this route, basically. This is quite well preserved. The big stupas inside. I think some of it has been repaired now, so it looks fairly in good shape. But I think there can still be many surprises. So we might, find, some texts on the ground that there could be a whole, a lot of things still waiting for us, or maybe some of it has already been sold to some private collectors. That's also what happened. Basically, say that the villager finds it, and then he thinks, okay, somebody might give me $100 for this, so they sell it, or even less. And then this one sells it to somebody in a bigger town who gives him $1,000. Then he sells it on and on. Maybe it passes through 5-6 hands before it lands on the international market. And some of these antique dealers in London, especially, they finally then sell it to the museums.
Do you think they are going to find the 5th Noble Truth, Ajahn Visaku?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, there might be some surprises, but the interesting conclusion from the scholars who study these texts, they say, so basically, like the core principles of the Dhamma teachings in there and the Vinaya is basically identical. There's no huge surprise, but the individual formulations and like specific formulations that we find in the suttas, maybe we have to take it like with a pinch of salt. Like if you find, say, in the Pāli version that this sutta was spoken at Savatthi to these people, and exactly like all these introductions, you might find in the other version that it's different. That it wasn't there, it was at Vaisali and spoken to someone else. So some of those formulations might not be exactly as we can't take it 100% sure, but like a lot of the verses, for example, some of the suttas that are often repeated in many versions and they are almost the same, is like the rhinoceros horn sutta, the Kagavisana, some of the suttas from the Sutta Nipata, the Atthakavagga, these kind of short verses, they seem to be like the most like secure and sure that those were really in that form. Also, certain suttas like the Samanyapala Sutta, Digha Nikaya number 2, the fruits of the monk's life, that again seems to be very popular and is repeated in the very similar versions. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting to compare.
Yes, I think that's good to remember when reading, for example, Udana or Itivuttaka suttas, is that the origin of the story and the verse can be different in that sutta. Is that the verses are usually the old text, and you don't know. Sometimes you can see that the story matches very well with the verse, but other times you can see that maybe the story had a later origin, like somebody composed this story inspired by the verse rather than the story being an authentic source of information. So it's you have to sometimes think about, do you treat this like a Jataka tale, or do you treat this like this is what happened?
Yes, exactly. So yeah, so for that reason, just treat the like suttas or whatever you come across, some formulations with a bit of caution. Like if there is some kind of unusual statement, maybe, or like I wouldn't make a huge conclusion, say, from one isolated statement, about something, some point of the doctrine or the teachings, because it might be a kind of a one-off statement, who knows, but the kind of often repeated statements, the central teachings that are always repeated, and you can be pretty sure that that's it, that you can rely on that.
The standardized formulas that are repeated across several suttas and across the different transmission lines, then those, you can almost certainly say those are from the first council.
Yeah, because it's such a huge collection of teachings that it would be like humanly impossible to just create it from nothing. So there must have been that original body of teachings that was preserved, and there were these bhanakas. So I think it seems like the monks formed different groups, and they had like the main teacher who knew the text, and then he had his students, and they would be basically reciting together. Like when we practice the chanting, the suttas together, then the teacher would know, and then he would check that they recited correctly, and that's how they would have divided the text in that way. There were like the Majjhima Bhanakas and the Dika Bhanakas. They would each know their section of the text.
Is there a tradition of is there a trace of the Bhanaka tradition here in the Gandhara region? Do you remember?
I think before it arrived there, maybe by the time Buddhism arrived there, it could have already been written, written version, or maybe very soon after it would have been written down. So when you start writing things down, you don't need to have this repetition so much anymore, right? Because that's what
as I remember, that in Sri Lanka, the delegation that comes with Ashoka, they are bringing the text orally, like they are reciting. They are not bringing written documents. And then in Sri Lanka, there's the Bhanaka tradition of the different recitation masters passing down the memory of the text to their disciples. And then there's a period of famine and war in Sri Lanka, where after which the Bhanaka monks have gone down so much in number that the king is afraid that the Bhanaka tradition will be extinct and the texts will be lost. And so it motivates the king to organize this large writing down effort in the Aluvihara. And yes, but so some of those Bhanaka monks, like there would be, I imagine, a back and forth between India and Sri Lanka, for example. Sometimes some of the Bhanaka monks go back there, or sometimes, some of them are imported there. They certainly fled, like when the famine was there in Sri Lanka, like some of these Bhanaka monks would have gone back to India. So I'm sure, that there would be surviving lineages in India as well of this continuing chanting tradition. And so, I was wondering whether that got to Gandhara, but you're saying, this is already like 1st century BC, they already have written texts, but there's no Buddhist community there before that. Then that would be a Bhanaka, like a chanting tradition.
Yeah, I think originally, yes. If it went there, say around the time of Ashoka, maybe 3rd century. So I think maybe for some time it would have been recited orally and then written down. And here, what I have on the screen is just to show you one particular example. So this is a Sri Lankan manuscript of the Dhammacakka Sutta, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which you can see how it's held together with this kind of wooden cover. Inside is also often some kind of nice drawing symbolizing the Four Noble Truths. And then here is the actual, you see, this is actually transcribed. So you can see the Dhammacakka. Dhammacakka.
It's like below.
Yes. So the way they do it is you take the palm leaf, you make it smooth, I think boiling in it first, and then you scratch basically these letters onto it, so it creates a little like a groove in the palm leaf, and then you put some kind of
imagine like a sharp pen, and that just scratches the leaf.
And then you put basically from the kind of an oily soot, like the ashes from the fire, from the wood, something black. You just rub it onto it, and that's what makes it dark, and it stays dark like this. You see? So this is the how you
In
would
the
be reciting the
in the Aluvihara in Sri Lanka, when we visited there, they had a kit that you could make your own manuscript with. They had a palm leaf there, and they had ink, and you could scratch something on the palm leaf, and you could make your own manuscript there.
Yeah, it's quite nice. Yeah, it's good to, because you realize how complicated it would have been. Just imagine, like I read somewhere that it used to be like the pride of every king or emperor, Buddhist emperor, to have like a complete Tipitaka, and they even associated like some maybe magical power coming from possessing this full Tipitaka. Imagine how much effort it would be to write all the suttas, all the Vinaya, all the Abhidhamma, and all these other things on these leaves. How many packs, how many bundles of these leaves you would need to store in? So how many monasteries do you think had like a complete collection of the suttas even? So probably very few, just like the few royal monasteries that were sponsored by like a king who would support, have this material support to finance this or to support the monks or whoever was writing it, because it would have been a lot of effort to do it. And then, but probably was enough to preserve the tradition. Or if they didn't have something, then the king would send a delegation to another country where they had the complete Tipitaka, and then try to bring it and then write it down. So this happened over time. So fortunately, the Pali version at least was preserved. But there are different manuscripts of, say, the Burmese and the Sri Lankan and so on. So like when the Pali Text Society was started in England in like 1890s, they just took a few examples. Like they went to Sri Lanka, the scholars, and they took like, say, 2 or 3 Sri Lankan versions, like of the Dhammacakka Sutta. Then they had 1 or 2 Burmese, maybe 1 from Thailand. And then based on that, they created like a critical edition, which is what you find then in the Roman script, which is then what we use. But they maybe didn't have a complete, maybe even today they make new editions because they realize, well, actually they had a very limited set of manuscripts to work with, and maybe there are some other readings in another manuscript that they haven't looked at. Yeah, so gives you an idea where these things come from. It's good to remember.
Yes, and these days we have the digital transmission era.
So you can find all these links. There is the Fragile Palm Leaves Foundation, which is I visited actually Professor Peter Skilling. He's a scholar that works in Thailand. I went there. Somebody took me to Thailand. At the Fragile Palm Leaves Foundation, this house. I think it's sponsored by some rich Thai lady, and he's collected a lot of manuscripts with all these different commentaries and things, even not strictly Buddhist. But this is only in Burmese script, and look how many. Then you just go into the archive, and you can search. For example, you can search for. Okay, this is a Vinaya Sankepa. This is a Vinaya, some kind of Vinaya commentary. So then you click on it. It's all been scanned. This is what it looks like originally, the bundle. This is something very similar to what we have here in our library, actually. And then you go, if you know the script, then you can just straight away start reading.
Can you zoom in, please?
See, so you can zoom in to this level, and they did. So now we have access to a huge amount of information. So these scholars now are starting to translate certain things. There's basically a lot more literature than we know, not just commentaries and sub-commentaries, but there are like other, like people continued in the Theravada world, especially in Burma, even in northern Thailand. They continued writing things in Pali, or in their local script, but based on Pali, until fairly recently, like some 200 years ago, maybe. So there's a lot there's a lot that still we can look at. Then there is another one, Buddhist Digital Archives. This is just for Sinhalese manuscripts specifically. So yeah, they keep adding, and I think because these things will basically be lost, because once you stop continually, copying these palm leaves, eventually they all fall apart, and you would lose it. So sometimes they cooperate like with the British Library or some other libraries. These have the Sanskrit, the Chinese, and here they have the Pāli. So then you can click and then say, this is a Vesantara Jataka. This is something. See, so this script is again different. This is Khmer script from Cambodia. And they might have... they use this script even in Thailand, just for Pali texts. They had a different script for the normal Thai text, but this is how it looks. And then you can go in, and if you know the script, you can read.
Can we zoom in, please, so we can see the letter shapes?
This is rather different from what we saw before. This is not so clear. But like in Thailand, Laos, Northern Thailand, Isan, they used at least like four different scripts for writing, and some of them are like really no longer in use now. So there's a lot to research if people are interested. Yeah. So here we are. Any questions? See, we covered quite a lot. There's a lot of scholarly articles now about this, and a lot of interest. We just need to know the basics, really, but it's good to be aware where these things come from.
Yes, I would like to know how one of these editing meetings went. When the monks are together and they say, "Oh, let's change, this line to sound a little bit better," and like how that process would work. Because then you would have to agree on, okay, this is how we're going to memorize it, and you have to pass that down. So there's a whole logistics in terms of if you have some new text that you're trying to establish, or like maybe you're trying to even correct mistakes, like you recognize that, maybe we're trying to correct something that was corrupted in the text, and so let's make sure that the other monks know about it. Like that would be, how do you pass down that information? I'm not expecting you to answer, just this is what comes to my mind.
Yeah, this is why you find, like, for some reason we're like, imagine how we chant, even we chant. Yeah, you come from Amaravati and you go to another monastery and you realize, well, this the way they chant the Dhammacakka, this line, it doesn't quite sound the same. Maybe they mispronounce one word or something. That's very natural, and that's how it would have been happening in those days too. Maybe the leading monk has a different kind of accent or something, and then that's it. That's how things happen. Or they drop. He just drops one word or something. Again, that happens. And then you get these very, very end readings.
No. Everybody would be very upset if he drops a word.
Well, but you know that some of our senior monks, for example, they basically maybe mispronounce something, and then everybody learns it from them. So it can happen, really.
May I ask one question?
Mm-hmm.
So when I check the dictionary, mainly Wiktionary, because it has very good etymology information, often, most of the time, the origin of the ancestry of the Pali words, it's coming from Sanskrit or Vedic language, but mostly in Sanskrit. So, but I don't think Pali language itself derived from Sanskrit, but it's derived from one of the Prakrit language, which is different, like development. Can you kind of give me the the big picture about that area?
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite the same. You can say it's related to Sanskrit, and the Sanskrit was like a kind of a sacred language that was kept by the Brahmins just to themselves. So they had their Vedas in that language, and it was considered sacred, and you couldn't share it with the non-Brahmins and so on. But the Buddha didn't want to actually make it like that. So he said you can transmit the teachings, you can learn the teaching in your own dialect. Sakaya Nirutiya. He says this means your own language, your own dialect. So he basically gave permission wherever he walked and taught that the people could remember it in that way, in that style, and take it further. So there wasn't like a sacred language that somebody wouldn't have to interpret or translate for them. So this was quite important. But later, for the purposes of preservation, it probably became necessary. That's why they had these meetings, maybe editorial meetings, where they did then standardize it. So the Pāli seems to be a kind of a standardized version of these different Prakrits, or the kind of vernacular dialects.
I think, say, for example, I would love, to ask this question, for example, from Venerable Bodhirasa, because he does this work, and so he has a better picture in his mind. But as I understand, for example, if I open one of these Pali dictionaries, like his dictionary, the DPD, and if they are listing some kind of Pali root, for example, or a Pali word, then my understanding is that that's useful to substantiate the meaning of the word. Like this Sanskrit word or this Sanskrit root is closely related or identical, but it doesn't necessarily imply that one is directly the origin of the other.
No, that's not how it's meant. It shows you what this word represents in Sanskrit, like the equivalent.
That's right. And so because now you then have two examples in two different domains, then the meaning of the root, for example, can be further substantiated. But they don't always have to have a one-to-one or a origin-source relationship.
I tell you one example why it's useful to have, like the Pali word sutta, yeah, Sutta, sutta. It depends where you find it in the Pali text, and then it can have two different meanings. And then that's why they tell you either if you find a Sanskrit equivalent, it can be either related to the sutra, like which means literally a thread, or I think sukta, which means like something that was heard. So, but when you put it in Pali, the Pali likes to blend, like the TR then becomes double T. What is sutra in Sanskrit? In Pali, it just they like to have sutta, but it could be from this other root. So it depends on the context, and you have to check with the Sanskrit equivalent.
So, John, is that safe to say Pali is the sibling language of Sanskrit, but it's not a descendant?
No, it's not descendant. No.
Yes, but the vocabulary is mainly borrowed from Sanskrit, like Latin for the English language. Is that true? Correct to say that?
Not borrowed again. It's just maybe they developed like in parallel in some way, and then Pali basically was only used specifically in the Buddhist world, but and then stopped being used in India altogether. Whereas Sanskrit, even until today, is actually still somehow used in India, and it became kind of the more modern, kind of the more popular language. So when you learn Thai language, for example, you find that they took over many words, both from Pali and from Sanskrit, but they took them over and they used them in different contexts. So you might have, for example, the word like dithi. ditti meaning view. So if in Thai language you're talking about, in a Buddhist context, talking about having views and opinions or something, then they will use the word ditti, just as in the Pāli. But the same word in its Sanskrit version would be drishti. Drishti is the Sanskrit for ditti, meaning view. But when it is used in Thai, they pronounce it trisadi. Drishti becomes trisadi, which means a theory. And that word means theory, like in the scientific sense or any kind of sense like that. See, so they were used like in the area of like science and all kinds of other sciences and knowledges that were outside of Buddhism. They used the Sanskrit. So there was this influence from India going all over Southeast Asia, and they adopted these words in different contexts.
Very much.
Okay, well.